we've all seen a lot of changes in the way that we assess student learning. And so right now I have my cam on, and that's pretty much just to show you that I am in fact a real person, but I'm gonna go ahead and turn it off so that we can focus on this wonderful PowerPoint presentation that I have for you. So I'm gonna give me a second here to maneuver around. There we go. You probably cannot see me anymore. So again, today we're talking about effective assessment and evaluation in online courses. And I am going to focus more today on online course instruction. Certainly what we go over today could apply to a hybrid course or a face-to-face course that hopefully is in a computer classroom. But primarily again, I'm going to focus on are ways that you can assess your students using digital tools. And so I always want to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As Wendy had indicated, I encourage you to ask questions, and you can put those into the chat feature of Zoom. And I will give you some natural pauses to ask questions. However, we can always go and I can answer questions before then, and I'll defer to Wendy to determine when that should be. The other thing is that I'm going to be showing you some examples from my course. And I am not proprietary in any way with my materials. And so I always say to folks, why reinvent the wheel? If you see something that you like, you can always just email me, and I'm happy to provide you with the directions that I use for my assessments. And there will be a place at the end of this slide where you will see my contact information. You're always welcome to contact me through phone, through email, whichever your preference is. The other thing that I'll mention is that I'm going to be, especially at the end, I'm going to be switching back and forth between the PowerPoint presentations and the examples, the digital online examples that I have to show you today. And so bear with me, because it takes a little bit of maneuvering to get from one screen to the other. And so without further ado, we're going to talk about, there's two objectives that we have today. And the first is that we're going to talk about the importance of aligning action verbs with a type of assessment. And this probably looks very familiar to you. This is Bloom's taxonomy. There's a lot of different iterations of this, or different versions of this, but they're all ways to assess different cognitive skills. And then our second objective is, again, to show digital assessments that measure the learner cognition of educational learning objectives. And I'm going to stress that, or I guess the presentation today is going to look at alternatives to our standard way of assessing students, which is primarily the use of writing assignments. And there's always a place for these, but I wanted to give you alternative digital ways to assess learning objectives. We're going to have less of a focus today on some of the lower level, the lower hierarchy of cognitive skills, and that's apply, understand, and remember. It's fairly easy to measure these particular levels of cognition. We can use it with standard tools in your learning management system. So your tests with multiple choice, true, false, sometimes a short answer, discussion board. All of those things are typically standard to our LMS. You might notice that I don't have apply on here. And the reason being is that a common mistake is that assessments stop at apply. And so in apply, the assessment requires a student to solve problems to new situations by applying acquired knowledge, facts, techniques, and rules in a different way. So nothing new is created. There is no blending of different concepts. There's no offering alternatives. And it's cliche, I know, but apply basically has the student think inside the box. And so what we're going to focus on today is create, evaluate, and analyze. And part of the reason for that is this is based on feedback and just sort of general observations regarding challenges of assessing this higher level thinking. And again, the focus will be on the digital tools to assess these objects, to assess your learning objectives that focus on create, evaluate, and analyze. Specifically today, I'm going to look at Powtoons, Adobe Spark, and Microsoft Forms. Here at Harford, we are a Microsoft school. Certainly your school may use Google. There are other alternatives. Google Forms is one of them. I'm just more familiar with Microsoft Forms, and that's the one that I'll demonstrate. And these are versatile tools. And part of it is that they give you a lot of different ways to frame your assessment. And again, I'm going to give you some examples from my course, but they can easily be adapted to fit your subject matter. And so hopefully, the other thing that I always hope to do is for you to, to give you the wow factor, and so that you have ideas and that you will be able to put them into your courses. Okay, so let's start with objective one. The ideal learning objective is a cognitive process and knowledge. So what that means is that you're using some of those action verbs. And again, the ones that we're talking about are create, evaluate, and analyze. And when we look at our course or our learning objectives, usually they start with these different verbs. And so in create, the student compiles information together in a different way. And there's key words here, different way, by combining elements in a new pattern or proposing new solutions. So evaluate is when a student presents and defends opinions by making judgments about the information or the validity of ideas or the quality of work based on a set of criteria. So we're going to look at some of those as well. We'll look at a create and an evaluate learning objective. And then analyze is when the student examines and breaks information into parts by identifying motives or causes. And it makes inferences and the student is finding evidence to support generalizations. So these are our higher level cognitive processes. They rely on our student to be able to understand our subject matter, but these are really how we go in and we have them work with that subject matter at a higher level. So create is actually one of my favorite cognitive processes to assess. And I'm going to use a learning objective that is from a political science course here at Towson. And it's formulate informed personal positions on political issues. And so the cognitive process that we're measuring or we're assessing is create. And the knowledge is about political issues. So my question to you is, when we look at an assessment that might be, or a way to measure this learning objective, a lot of times we'll use the word examine. So for example, here we go, Chuck Todd on Meet the Press. If I gave an assessment that said examine the debate, this actually is not a assessment that is something that would measure a creative cognitive process. Okay, and we're going to come back to that one. So another one, this is from Laura at Prince George's Community College. Hi, Laura. And this learning objective basically falls under the create domain as well. Role play requires a student to take their understanding of interpersonal skills and create original work. And again, hold that thought, because I'm going to circle back, and some of the examples that I'll give you will be ones that could easily be adapted. So for example, we're going to go over Powtoons today. And Powtoons would be a great digital tool to use to assess this specific learning objective. Now, sometimes there are sneaky learning objectives where when we look at them, at first glance, we see those action verbs and we think, oh, okay, this is apply. But when you really look at the heart or the center of this particular learning objective, it's actually really an evaluate learning objective. And we can thank my colleague, Cindy Kelly, for providing this example. This is an adaptation of a gen ed objective here at Harford Community College. And basically, Cindy has just plugged in the subject matter into this particular evaluate learning objective. So decision-making skills, again, they fall under the evaluate domain. And this learning objective is about forming conclusions about the topic based on criteria. So, deciphered, what this learning objective is really looking at is evaluate community and environmental health issues typical of a diverse society. We have one that's very similar to that, and this is Heather from Frederick. For this learning objective, we're going to focus on the word evaluate. A student cannot evaluate an issue that they don't understand. And so the use of the word identify, it's there for a purpose, but it would be something that needed to happen before, a student must be able to identify moral issues and conflicts before they can evaluate them. Okay, and then I did not get any questions or any requests to talk about analyze, but we all have this learning objective. And so in a sense, I think of analyze, this is just me personally, I think about analyze as the opposite of create. It takes things apart to better understand them as a whole. So an example here, and this is from public health, which I teach here at the college, is that there are 3 core functions in public health. And within each function, there are essential services. So when I look at this, or when students look at this, and they can do an analyzation, each service can be evaluated, but always reassembles as part of the whole, which is public health. So I can tell you that my students who just finished Intro to Public Health are looking forward to a analyze-free break. We did a lot of it in that course. So we're going to come to a natural pause here. And this gives us an opportunity whether or not there are any questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Wendy to tell me whether or not there are.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. There are none in the chat right now, but please, if there, continue as you continue. If anybody does have anything, please just put it in the chat, and we can let Deb know along the way.
Yeah,
nothing right now.
Okay, I always laugh and say I'm very thorough, right? So there's never questions.
Exactly.
So we're going to go into the second objective, and you're going to see as we go through some of these that there are overlaps in cognitive processes in certain examples. And so what I typically call this is that it's a really, really high level assessment. And so the first one that we'll talk about is Powtoons. And Powtoons has the ability to measure everything, all 3 of those cognitive processes: evaluate, create, compare, and contrast. And so this one I think is great for the role play assessment, or the role play learning objective, because there's a classroom feature in Powtoons that allows students to collaborate and create scenes. Now, there is a subscription that is required for Powtoons, and I swear that they do not pay me to promote their product. It's a digital tool that I've been using for a long time now, and I really, really like it. It's very versatile. It gives students a lot of different opportunities to show what they know. And so what I'm going to do today in a few minutes here is I'm going to show you an example of a public health learning objective that I have students complete an assignment using Powtoons. And that's compare and contrast the medical and public health care systems. I have used this for other courses and other learning objectives. So evaluate the impact of lifestyle on eating behaviors. This is one where a student or where students create a character and they move through the trans theoretical model and they sort of give a visual presentation of what the person would be eating, how they would be behaving, and what factors influence all of those choices that they make. And so the other part, and this is what I really like, is in exercise science, I also have them use Powtoons. And I take all 4 of the learning objectives that are in that course. We pull them all together to create a story. And recall that that's what Create is about. It's about pulling a lot of different elements together to create something new. But again, I'm going to show you what I do for my public health course. And this is the place where I'm going to switch gears and show a different screen. And now hopefully everyone can see my Powtoons that's up there. If not, please let us know in the chat and we'll see what we can do. So again, this is the learning objective is compare and contrast the medical and public healthcare systems. And what I'm going to show you, and I highly recommend this, is that anytime you use a digital tool, that you provide the student with an example of what you're trying to assess. And so this is, you'll hear, this is actually me talking.
This video demonstrates how private healthcare differs from public health. We'll use high cholesterol levels as an example. High levels of cholesterol in the blood are often associated with a diet high in saturated fat. However, about 1 in 500 cases is the result of a genetic problem. A person whose blood cholesterol level exceeds 200 milligrams per deciliter is at twice the risk for heart disease. Bummer. Private healthcare sector, often referred to as private medicine, focuses on treatment that is provided by entities other than the government. In private medicine, a person with high cholesterol is viewed as a patient who would be seen by a primary care practitioner for treatment. Primary care treatment for high cholesterol could include prescription medications such as statins to reduce blood levels and nutrition counseling to change eating habits. In some cases, the primary care practitioner might refer the patient to a specialist, such as a lipid specialist, for additional treatment. Public health focuses on protecting and improving the health of people and their communities with a focus on disease prevention. Here, primary prevention would address the entire community with the objective of reducing specific risk factors associated with high blood cholesterol. Primary prevention activities could include public service announcements about making healthy eating choices. A major public health milestone is the ACA nutrition label mandate that now requires menus to show nutrition information so that people can make informed decisions about what they eat. Primary prevention could also include a mobile diagnostic clinic that offers cholesterol screenings. Primary healthcare follows the one patient to one healthcare practitioner model for the medical treatment of disease. In comparison, public health primary prevention considers what can be done at the community level to reduce risk factors associated with a disease.
Okay, so that is an example. That is an example of an assessment that will that focuses on analyzation. Remember, compare and contrast are always those action verbs that are about the analyzation cognitive domain. I'm going to go ahead and switch back again to our PowerPoint presentation. There we go. And Powtoons, again, it's very versatile. It is a subscription, like I said. However, it is very affordable for educators. I believe it's $120 for the year. The students do like it. I think sometimes they find it a little frustrating, but the way that I always sort of frame frustration for students is that if you're frustrated, that means you're thinking critically. And typically, this would be an assignment that I would give them a little bit more time to complete so that they can get over a bit of that learning curve of how to use the tool. So the other one that I use is Adobe Spark. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of how I have used it for those learning objectives that are about analyzation. And they are specifically analyzing significant events, ideas, and figures. And I've got 3 different examples. The first one is the Affordable Health Care Act is actually one that I have created. And one of the reasons why I like Spark is that it has the ability, and you'll see this in a few seconds, that you can actually embed your instructions into a presentation to help guide students with the directions on how to complete it. You can also use Adobe Spark for evaluate nutrition claims in the popular press to determine legitimacy and accuracy. That's part of the human nutrition course that I teach. And I'm going to show you 4 different examples from the course, including the one that I use as the demonstration. All right, so this is the Affordable Care Act, and what Spark really is, it's sometimes it calls itself a web page. I talk about it, I frame it more in terms of a presentation, and in a sense it's an alternative to a PowerPoint presentation, but it's got that scrolling down feature. So for this particular assignment, I wanted students to construct a timeline of the Affordable Care Act, and what I had them do was, and here you can see that it's a template. Remember that this is about this particular learning assessment, or I'm sorry, learning objective was about analyzing. And so here I can show them 2010. I wanted them to give me an action item that was phrased as a question. And then they would give me a summary of the different years, what happened. And they would also give me video. One of the things, I'm sure you have experienced this as well, is that our students will have a difficult time being able to identify reliable sources of information. And so it was important in this particular assignment that we also put into it the ability to determine reliable sources of media, which is sometimes a challenge because we always have focused on reliable sources of text, of written information. And so I gave them examples of what would be considered a reliable source of information on this topic. And just went through it again and sort of provided examples of what I wanted them to, what this assignment should be about. And it also gave us an opportunity to talk a little bit or to go over citations. You're going to notice that there are no citations at the end of this presentation, and that's because I always have them, whenever we do these sorts of things, I always have them provide a separate works cited page or works cited file. Okay, so here are some examples of what other students have done, and this comes from my exercise science class, and this was the analyze significant events, ideas, and figures in American sports history. And so this particular one was about women's basketball. And you can see that the student, what I like about these, and even though we're using this to analyze analyze learning objective, is that there is also creation here. The student is using creative process to make their Spark presentation. And that's where, if you recall, I said some of these assessments are going to combine and look at a lot of different cognitive processes. But you can see that she did construct a different timeline, and she looked at all the way, actually went back to 1892. And in this particular case, the assignment was strictly writing about it and finding pictures that sort of were demonstrative of the text, what they were saying. And they were able to put some quotations in there, lots of good stuff. It's always nice when I get one from a student and I'm like, wow, that's great. The other one is from the human sexuality course that I teach. And this particular student chose to construct a timeline of LGBTQ rights in the USA. And I'll go through some of these as well. This one was just great. I thought that it was really nice how he assembled it, but all of the component parts that were required were also present. And again, in here, one of the parts of the assignment was that they needed to find a video from a reliable source that also addressed what their different events were. And you can see, did a really nice job of finding those events and finding visuals that were representative of those different events. Now, the great thing about Spark is that it's free. You don't have to pay for anything. The student doesn't have to pay. You don't have to pay for it. So I really do like it. And I'll also show you how I've had students use Spark for an evaluate, and that again is evaluate nutrition claims in the popular press to determine legitimacy and accuracy. And so this is from a student who created a product called Buff Stuff. And the way that this assignment worked was that the student had to create an ad, and then another student had to go in and identify, now that is the first part of our, that's the first learning cognition, right? They need to be able to identify. So this person needed to know what are different parts that, or different things that you can use to determine whether or not something is an example of quackery. But then they had to go in and actually evaluate it as well. And so it had these different components that were required. And you can see some of them. This one I particularly liked at the end because who doesn't like to look at Henry Cavill? But then after this was published, another student would go in and again, they would evaluate it. Okay, and sometimes you can see here at the bottom that Spark, if you use some of the images that they recommend, they'll go ahead and put at the bottom the credits for the images that you use. The other nice thing about this too is that typically find that students are okay with citing, again, those text or those, I call them words. They can find words and cite them, but they're not always that good at knowing how to cite images. And more, since we are talking about digital information, we need to stress with our students that they need to be cited as well. Visuals, pictures, images need citations. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back again. And we'll go over.
Deb, while you're doing that, there is one quick question from group chat.
Okay.
Easy. With Powtoons, is it just you recording your voice over a video you create, or can you also take a video of yourself?
That's a great question. So yes, you can take a video of yourself and you can put it in. It has an upload feature. So Powtoons will give you, and I'll pull it up just so that you're able to sort of see what it looks like as the instructor, and you know what's on your side. But there is an upload feature. So they're going to give you a couple of different versions, or I'm sorry, they're going to give you what they call assets that you can use. But then the student can also bring in images and video as well and blend them in. So I'm going to pop that up for just a second here. Give me a moment to log in. And I'll show you what the interface looks like. We'll go ahead and switch over to okay, so I'm in a classroom and I have a lot of this. So Powtoons is a British company, and I love the British companies and their tech. And they sort of started that whole idea of seats. And so you have a certain number of seats within your license that you can create different classrooms. You can see there's my public health. I use Powtoons for an assignment where they create a public service announcement. But I can add a couple different classrooms in here. And so if I was going to, I'll just show you an example of how this works. I'm going to go into some that I have already created. And oftentimes I'll create some while we're just sort of, there are times when I will work with students synchronously using some like a web conferencing type tool, and we'll go through and I'll sort of show them, particularly if they have some challenges in using the software, we'll go over how to use it. And so we'll just kind of pull one of these up as an example, and it loads up. Okay. And then there are many different ways that I can add content. And there are different, what they call, again, assets. So up here, they group their assets into different themes. So a lot of times I use Modern Edge. And then it can give me some prefabricated backgrounds and scenes, where then I can, let's say that I'm trying to create something based on a concept. There's specifics, there's situations, there's concepts. And I'm going to plug that one in. So it's going to give me different, what it calls assets. So each character, each word, all of these different things, but I can change them out. So this is what Powtoons offers. There's also, again, the ability, so I'm going to go into videos, to put in your videos. You see this is a little place where you can upload your video. You click on it, you find it, you know, where you have it on your hard drive or on your computer, and then upload it, and you can pull it into this as well. You can also add in images. So they give you some, but then you can also upload your images as well. And this also is an opportunity then for students to be able to identify images that they can use. This, you know, using a Google search on the different rights to images. So a lot of different things that we can kind of sneak in to our overall assessment of a learning objective skills, such as being able to identify what are reliable sources, what can I use without copyright infringement, all kinds of good stuff.
And we did have one quick follow-up, and then I won't interrupt anymore until you're ready.
That's okay.
Someone asked if you had used Adobe Spark's video feature for student projects, and if you did, how would it compare to Powtoon?
So I have used, well, students have used, I've given them that option to use Adobe Video. And I think it's probably fairly similar. The difference is that the feature in Powtoons that I like is that classroom collaboration, which I don't think Adobe Spark has that functionality. I would guess, and I've worked more with the Spark webpage presentation, not as much with the video, but what I've seen from the videos that students have sent me is it also is somewhat limited in the different things, assets that they have that you can work with. Other questions at all, Wendy?
Nope, that's it. Thank you.
So let's go back again to the presentation. And the final thing that I'm going to show you is Microsoft Forms. I use these a lot for evaluation, and I like using these a lot. Forms is a very versatile, and I'm going to show you how we've used it in human sexuality, specifically how we use it to evaluate information to assist in healthy sexual decision making. So this is an attitudes and practice survey that students construct in order to evaluate. I'm going to go ahead and switch again. I think I'm with you. There we go. Okay. And here at Harford, our students have a 365 account as well. And so what this is that they create an attitudes and practices survey. And what they're trying to get at, and the reason why this is a good example of an evaluate assessment, is that they're pulling information from their peers. And this is just sort of an example of what are other students, how do other students look at this? What are their attitudes? What do they do? Which is always a tricky thing in a class, and we have to have conversations about what they can reasonably ask that are practices. But the other part of this that I really like is that it gives the students some feedback, and we can talk about then how to evaluate the information. I'm just going to switch us off for a second over to back to our presentation, and then I'm going to get in and I'll show you a little bit how this works for those of you who may not be familiar with Office. And I'm wondering how many of you are a Microsoft campus, but I don't think we did a poll feature here. So let's see here. I'm going to get in, and I apologize because it was my intention to have this loaded up prior to this presentation, but super fast. Go into forms, and I'm going to switch us back. There we go. Okay, so these are different examples of forms. And I'm going to come back just a second to the evaluate assessment that we do in human sexuality, just to kind of show real quick some of the other ways that I've used forms. One of the challenges I'm sure that we all have faced is the students writing, the ability to write objectively, the ability to use formal voice. And so a lot of times what I do as extra credit is before there is a writing assessment, I'll go in and I'll create a form that students can go through and answer questions, and with the intention of having them work on some of their skills that they would then, of course, use in their writing assignment. And so here is an example of one. And the nice thing about forms from my end, not just exclusively, we will have our students use this as a tool to create things, but I can create things as well. And I can give information. I have the ability to put in some text, and then I can assess them of their understanding of these different writing skills. So that's another sort of clever way, I think, to use forms. But here we go. We're going to go back to an example of the survey that I just showed you. And there were 10 responses. And the nice thing about it is it pops up some really nice graphics that the students can use. So we can go over how to evaluate based on some of the data. And of course, they would have more questions than just these two, because this is an example. We can take these things and then plug them into they use this information then to evaluate. This is stuff that they can use so that they can make those decisions about, and this was about hookup culture. What are the attitudes of my peers? What are their practices? I have this information. How can I use it to make those? How can I evaluate it to make decisions about what I want to do? So I'm going to go ahead and switch back again to our presentation. So that's pretty much what I have to show today. But I think the takeaway here, hopefully, is that there are other ways. There are digital tools that we can use to assess our students' understanding of learning objectives. But again, it's very important that those assessments align with the cognitive process that we are attempting to measure. And there's a lot of different ways with those 3 different tools. There's a lot of different ways that you can frame them to get at those assessments. So that's it for me today. I was Is there other questions that I can answer?
If anyone wants to unmute and ask or put them in the Zoom group chat, if you want to go ahead and do so. I do have just one little one, but let's let everyone else ask first. Okay, question. Have you ever used these tools for group work?
I have. Particularly, I've used Powtoons for group work because that's sort of the nice feature of the classroom is they can go in and they can work together. And so that was one of my thoughts when I saw the learning objective about role play is that you could construct an assessment where two students had to create characters. How would one respond to the other? It just depends on the intent. What are you trying to measure? But that is a good example of how people could work together. Role play is difficult to assess, right? In an online learning environment, because the two people aren't always there together, right, to be able to do this. But they can work together then to create alternatives. With Adobe Spark, there is likely a way that you can do a collaboration. I think with Adobe Spark, the primary thing is that the student has a unique login in order to get in there. And so, you would have to think through how you would protect that information. I don't know that you would want to have students using the same login credentials to get into the Spark. But one of the ways that you could potentially have it as group work is that you could have a person, create a Spark presentation and then have another person very similarly to what I do in the nutrition class, have another person come in and evaluate it. And that is a form of group work as well. I've had students open it up to the entire class as a whole using a discussion board feature, and we're a Blackboard campus. And there's a lot of different ways that you can create a collaborative experience for your students.
Just real quick, when you talked about having the Microsoft 365 campus and how some are and some aren't, are there things that you can use even if you're not a part of that? If your campus, can you cross out of that, or is it you have to stick within the paid version or whatever your campus chooses? In other words, so I'm Maryland Online, I'm not an institution, but some of these tools would be really great, but I don't have the access that you guys have as campuses. Can you cross over? And
yeah. You can certainly create things that a person can see, and they don't have to have a 365 account. However, like many software companies, Microsoft is very proprietary about their tools. And so in order to collaborate with a person who is not necessarily part of your institution or has a 365 account, it becomes a little bit trickier. There are ways to do it, but it's a little clunky. And so what I would suggest is if you're not a 365 campus, that you look to see what tools are available to you. Google has a suite of different options. You can use Forms in Google for collaboration. And I'm sure there are others, but those are the two that I am most familiar with. I'm not as familiar with iOS or Mac tools that may be capable of doing that, so Pages and that sort of thing. We occasionally have a student who is a Mac user. And the nice thing about 365 is it's up in the cloud, and so the Mac student doesn't necessarily have to have Microsoft tools, desktop tools on their computer in order to be able to complete the assignment.
Got it. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Deb. This was very informative. And again, you will all receive a copy of the slides and that have some of the tools listed, and as well as the recording if you'd like to review it or share it later. Thank you, everyone. And if you have any ideas for webinars, send them my way. Otherwise, just wait for the email from me with the recording. Thanks. Thanks, Deb.
Yep, no problem.